to ring in the happy hour, we bring John McMullen into the conversation as the Eagles with a much-needed, hard-fought, back-and-forth roller coaster-esque victory last night, John, and you picked the Eagles to win. Did they win the way you thought they would?
Yeah, they did. It kind of unfurled as I expected. A little bit more of a struggle defensively. I didn't have Green Bay piling up that much yardage because they struggled, but hey, the Eagles got some issues at that cornerback position. Just wrote about that on 973ESPN.com. They're going to bring back Orlando Scandrick. We'll see if they make a bigger, splashier move, and we all know who that involves. But
yes,
it's a bad situation for them at corner, and it has more to do. It's good that Avonte Maddox looks like he's going to be okay, but it's got more to do than just the injuries. When the guys are out there, they're not playing well.
All right, well, a lot of questions to get into. You know, we'll dive into the game here, but obviously you hit on something that's going to be a question over the next 10 days. What do they do in that secondary? Darby's out. We assume that Maddox is going to be at least up in the air. Sidney Jones left again. I don't know that he can be counted on. Where does the secondary turn from here? Does it scream that Howie gets on the phone and maybe ups his ante for some bigger names? We know where I'm headed, but they brought Scandrick in. But is there another move in that secondary to be made?
Well, I think it's going to be interesting because I think in a lot of ways, and that's what I just wrote about, I think this will tell you where the Eagles believe they are after this first quarter of the season. You're sort of having a mini bye. You get to take a step back and self-scout a little bit. And, you know, do you think you're still that championship contender that you were before the season, or if you lowered and tempered those expectations? I think if it's the former, you should go get Jalen Ramsey. I think if it's the latter, because of the age of your roster, you don't want to give up the significant assets it's going to take to get him. So in a lot of ways, and it's not about getting him, it's about going after him. And, you know, if somebody outbids you, you tip your cap to them. But I think if the Eagles are heavily involved, it tells you where they believe they are with the organization, because Orlando Scandrick is not the answer. I think, you know, history tells us Ronald Darby's going to be out for a month from the original hamstring injury, so he's not coming back for the Jets. Sidney Jones, we know his history. He's not going to be back for the Jets, and that leaves Avonte Maddox, who has an opportunity. The bigger issue, he had a concussion and a neck injury, but the bigger issue is getting through the concussion protocol, and the extra days help him. So he might be back for that Jets game, believe it or not. And then you have Ajeen Harris on the practice squad, and as you mentioned, Scandrick is back. Hey, Rasul Douglas is the number one corner, and I think Rasul is the one guy who has played better than people expected, but having him as your number one corner, that's not a good thing.
Oh, you're going to make all these West Virginia guys upset, John. let me
Do
ask
you disagree, Jeff?
No, I cannot disagree with
I don't
you.
disagree either.
I know.
I
disagree.
If he's your number one corner, then you're...
You don't have a number one corner.
Yeah, you're in trouble.
John, why don't we talk, and I asked this to Sal Powell, and I've kind of been putting it out today, and maybe it's out there and we just don't know about it, but I feel like everyone focuses on Ramsey, but, you know, Miami's got Xavier Howard. The Broncos, if they go to 0-4, maybe looking to move on from Chris Harris and just try to get some draft picks. I mean, there's got to be some other names around the league that make sense for right now. Any of those guys would be the best corner on the Eagles, bar none.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, Xavier Howard specifically, I mean, from an age standpoint and what it would cost, obviously far less than Jalen Ramsey, and he's got some upside. I think that would make a lot of sense. You can no longer throw into the equation with the Dolphins. I mean, in theory, that's the kind of player they should want to hold on to, but you could have said that about other players they traded, Console, Fitzpatrick. They're all young players who are ascending, who are good players, and I don't know what the heck they're doing. So, yeah, certainly Howard could be available. Chris Harris, I don't know. There's some size deficiencies there. Is he better than what you have? Sure, no question. I've always thought of him more as a slot guy, although he's a little bit – I see Avonte Maddox as a younger Chris Harris. He's nowhere near that from an accomplishment level, but I think there's some redundancy there if you like Maddox. So I don't necessarily see him as a fit. And if this team believes it's a Super Bowl contender, and I still think they do, go get the All-Pro. Go get the guy who's going to lock down. That fixes a position. That fixes a position that you've had issues with for years. And, if you go all the way back to training camp, and people said this team was deep at corner. Well, no, you were assuming a lot of things. There's not a lot of good corners here. Go get one.
Well, it feels like, John, they were deep at corner is because they had a lot of it's like having a lot of number 2 pitchers. You don't have an ace. You have a bunch of number 2s and 3s. And I think we look at it like, well, they got a lot of nice players, and they're all average, right? They're all kind of average.
Well, I think we thought they had a bunch of 2s and 3s. Turns out they had a bunch of 4s and 5s.
Oh.
So I put myself in this category. We overrated this group, probably significantly. Part of it with Darby is health. I mean, he can play. But he's had so many injury issues here, and he's coming off the ACL. And he's not comfortable when he was out there. So you throw that into the equation. But Avonte, and I don't want to pick on him certainly on this day, but I mean, people were, and I called it forced versatility. He was forced to play different positions, and people kind of connected that with accomplishments. And I just because he was forced to play weird positions doesn't mean he's a good player. And at least he hasn't been early this year. Hopefully he gets healthy and he gets back playing well. But I think it's pretty clear, with the exception of Rasul Douglas, most people, and myself I include in this category, overrated just about every corner on this team.
John, last night I asked Mike and Moshe this, and I want your thoughts. What did you learn from the game last night? Going into the game, there was a lot of hot topics and storylines with the offense and the defense and multiple positions, and we weren't sure if it was one-offs, trends, or what the case was. So what did you learn from the game?
Well, I learned a couple things, and I called it a temperature game for both sides. One, the Packers' defense isn't the 85 Bears, as I expected. As I said on the show, they were playing a bunch of bad offenses. They finally played a well above average quarterback, and they had a lot of issues. They can't defend the run. And from the Eagles' perspective, hey, that offensive line is good. And I don't know why people continuously say it isn't, but I think I mentioned context every single day on this show. And I don't think enough people in Philadelphia look at the rest of the league. So even when that offensive line is struggling, it's better than everybody else's offensive line, with the possible exception of Dallas, which is obviously in the same division. It's good. And when they're clicking on all cylinders, I mean, those holes yesterday, you don't see those types of holes in NFL games. Jordan Howard specifically on that one run, somebody, I wish I could give him credit on Twitter, superimposed 5 Jordan Howards could have fit through that hole. You don't see that in the NFL.
John, what did you let's talk a little about the defense. And I think we know the corners are an issue. And I hate to be all negative on a big win, but the more I see Zach Brown out there, and Sendejo plays a lot in big nickel, Cyprian got some snaps, they're also struggling for as good as they are in run defense and getting the opponent into second and third and long. They're pretty bad at covering on third down. I know it's Aaron Rodgers, and he's great. But it seems like they've got some interior coverage issues that they've got to resolve too.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at it, you look at the strength of the players. I mean, Zach Brown is a great run defender, a sort of almost a throwback. This is probably not the era he should be playing in, but he struggles in coverage. He's just better than everything else you have when you're playing two linebackers. And then the safeties. I mean, Sendejo is physical as all heck, but what does that get you in this modern era of football, except flags and your own players injured? Struggles in coverage, you saw it with Jimmy Graham. Jimmy Graham had been struggling mightily before the Eagles game, and he dropped a touchdown as well. At least he got his hands on it, but on that fourth down play. And then Sipper, and his strength is box safety as well. So all of those guys aren't coverage players. And, you know, part of it is you lost so many corners, you're down, you had to play the safeties. It's not like Jim wanted to. But if the corners are healthy, they don't cover well either. And I predicted Devontae Adams would have a great game because he's such a good route runner, and these corners struggle with really sharp route runners. I didn't expect it to be that big. And if he would have stayed healthy, who knows how much yardage he would have piled up.
John, when you talk about the Eagles' defense, they got absolutely cut up by Aaron Rodgers, like we've been talking about. But I feel better about the defense after watching last night because it was the bend but don't break, that overused phrase that we've used in the past when talking about the Eagles' defense. And Packers, 2 red zone trips led to field goals, 2 more led to nothing. How do you assess them as a group now, trying to take the injuries out of it? Do you feel like they can get some swagger back and maybe really, make stops when it matters the most in the red zone, as long as they don't give up the big plays in between the 20s?
Well, I mean, that's the hope. I think you got to be realistic about the limitations. They just don't have finishers on the pass rush, which we've talked about a lot. So even when they do get pressure, they tend to not finish, with the exception of Derek Barnett yesterday in the strip sack, which was a big, huge play. And then they don't cover well. That's really a bad formula. But you do have to give them credit. They're lights out against the run. I mean, the Packers couldn't do anything. I know Matt LaFleur is getting a heck of a lot of criticism there for pass on the 2 drives into the red zone that went to fourth down, didn't convert. But, I mean, if you're him, what are you going to bang your head against the wall and try to run it or put the ball in the hands of Aaron Rodgers? I don't blame him at all. And then you could argue that was probably PI at the end of the game as well, but the Eagles got away with one. So, hey, you take the win, but you got to be realistic about it and say there's still some issues there.
John, what's the corresponding move now that Orlando Scandrick is brought in? I'm curious if Alex Ellis goes back to the practice squad and they go thin at tight end, or they've carried a lot of safeties and a lot of linebackers. Maybe one of those guys? Can't be corner.
Yeah, I mean, there's some options. I mean, they don't dress Nate Herbig at all. They don't dress Sharif Miller at all. I don't think there's any problem getting either of those guys through waivers. In Miller's case, they might not want to because he's a draft pick. It's difficult when you have short-term injuries, obviously, as you know, Jeff, because you got to carry these guys on 53.
Right.
And that's the type of tough decision you have to make. But the Eagles are always seemingly carrying a couple young players that don't play. And at this stage, is anybody else going to give them a 53-man roster spot and pick them up off waivers? You got to be careful because injuries pile up, but I think you could get players like that through waivers.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com, at JF McMullen. Follow him on Twitter. It's going to be a crazy 10 days here. We know there's going to be a lot of questions. Deshaun Jackson, will he be back? Craig James, do we see him getting major playing time? I mean, the LeBlancs, aren't available. Mills still not available. We talked a lot about there, but there's going to be a lot of things that this week's going to be pretty important for Howie Roseman, don't you think?
Yeah, it is. More for the off-the-field stuff than on the field. I mean, this is a great situation for the Eagles as far as having that mini bye, because you do get a few extra days to get some players a little bit healthier. In a shorter week, for instance, there's probably no chance that Maddox gets back, but that extra time will help him pass the protocol. And then the opponent on the back end is a really bad football team. So you could probably muddle through it, and you have another week until you have to play a legitimate opponent or a more legitimate opponent. So it's helpful from that standpoint as well. But, I mean, they have to – that's the biggest question. They have to answer. And it can't be just – well, it can. They could just add Orlando Scandrick and be done with it. But I don't think that's going to get it done long term. You're going to beat the Jets, but you're going to struggle down the line.
So moving forward then, I guess, we've had these discussions over the years. We had it last week. Jordan Howard, Miles Sanders, run more. They ran last night. It was very successful. Howard seemed to be, I don't want to say they split him, but he seemed to be the guy they trusted more. They gave him the ball at the goal line, put it that way. When they needed someone to get in the end zone, it was Howard. Did we learn anything about the run game? Like, does Doug feel like, you know what, I found my guy, I got my guy? Because we have been critical of, get better backs. The backs aren't good enough. Did they prove us wrong last night?
Well, I think, Jordan Howard is good enough as far as being, I don't want to overstate it, but he's proven he's an above-average running back in this league. The Eagles just hadn't been using him. They did in Green Bay. It worked out well. He's got 3 touchdowns, first Eagles running back to have 3 scores since Shady McCoy. So, and then Miles Sanders, I think the kickoff return, I think the whole problem with Miles, nobody's doubting his talent. He was just running with a lack of confidence, and I think that kickoff return gave him a little confidence, and that does wonders. So he looked a lot sharper as well. And I don't think Doug is going to choose. It's going to be that committee approach, and he's proven it time and time again, and that's how he's going to go about it. I do think you have to be realistic, as I mentioned, that Green Bay's really bad defending the run, and there will be tougher teams, so it's not always going to be that easy, even with a great offensive line, but it was certainly a positive step.
Now, this is an interesting stat here. The Packers got to the 1-yard line with less than 10 minutes and threw 4 incompletions. The Eagles blitzed on 3 of those downs. The only time they had success blitzing all night. Rodgers was 5 of 6 for 151 yards and a touchdown against the blitz prior to that drive. So we hear so much blitz, blitz, blitz. They blitzed them on the blitz last night. However, Jim Schwartz has got to be scratching his head thinking, what do I need to do to try to get some going? If I blitz, I can't do it. I'm not getting enough for my 4-man rush here. So is there any going back to the drawing board for Jim Schwartz here?
He's tried everything. So unless, talked about it a little bit earlier in the week, unless Fletcher Cox gets back to his all-pro level, I think they're going to continue to struggle. They've been gashed by the blitz pretty much all year. I was surprised they blitzed as much as they did against Aaron. It's a little bit easier at the goal line because you have less room. So you don't have to worry as much about the corners. They understand they have that end line. There's a finite area they have to cover, so it's a little bit easier to do it down there. And I think you'll continue to see that. If anything, until Ronald Darby gets back, until Sidney Jones gets back, or until they bring in a viable corner in the mold of whether great corner like Jalen Ramsey or Howard, who's just a better corner, I think he's going to have to stop doing it as much as he does because they are getting gashed on the blitz.
Packers defense allowed 34 points, the most they've allowed at home since 2014. So we talked about how much better their defense had been this year. We talked about it yesterday on the show, John, that it reminded me of that Denver game that they gave up 55. Was they just really hadn't played anybody. So do you give you got to give the Eagles offense some credit that they were able to get the yards they were against the Packers. But are the Packers, in other words, should we not be as impressed as we are about scoring 34 against them? Is their defense not as good as we thought they were?
Yeah, that's what I said all week. I mean, that's why I picked the Eagles. Nobody looked at their opponent. This was the first, and people in Green Bay were talking about it, this was the first good quarterback they faced this season. And now they have a tougher road when it comes to solid quarterbacks. Yeah, I mean, you had to wait. It was a small sample size. They deserve credit for adding talent. The players they have added are better than the players they replaced. So as a whole, it's a better defense. But I think when you get through 16 games and you revisit this, I think they're going to be middle of the road. They're going to be nowhere near a top 5 defense, which is what they look like for, as I said, in a very small sample size. But you have to look at Mitch Trubisky, descending Joe Flacco, and Kirk Cousins, who's really been terrible early in the season. I mean, and then Carson Wentz shows up. So, I mean, that's a big difference. And I think everybody knew there it was going to be more of a struggle. Turned out to be more of a struggle than I think they even thought. And the most amazing statistic is 58-0-1. Aaron Rodgers as a starting quarterback at home when getting a 10-point lead at any point in the game. He's now 58-1-1.
By the way, I thought Mac Hollins had a pretty nice, tough catch in that. Alshon had dropped the pass, and then it was third down, and Mac Hollins had a pretty nice slant over the middle, just to throw that out there with all the drops last week. John McMullen at JF McMullen. Eagles win 2-2. More on this game and the next 10 days on our website, 97.3ESPN.com. Thanks, John.
All right, thank you, guys.